Hi, welcome back to CFX Download. I'm Amy McLean, editorial director, and I'm here with my colleagues John Saavedra and Noah Ziegler. And it is March Madness, and I am not talking about basketball. It is March merger madness. Late last night, Nexstar announced the close of its $6.2 billion Tegna acquisition after a little bit of drama during the day. We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about the latest updates on Charter and Cox's merger, and we even have a surprise one that was thrown in along the way. So there's plenty of March merger madness. And I guess we'll start with the biggie, right? Nexstar-Tegna. You know, I kind of had a suspicion at 2 a.m. In the morning yesterday. I had an email from the AGs, the state AGs, saying they were having a press conference to try to block the deal. And that's usually a good indicator that we're pretty close to the deal close. Like the FCC is going to make their move, which Brendan Carr had already said he was supportive of it. So I kind of thought we were going to see movement, but like 6 o'clock rolled around and nothing happened. I thought, oh, we're safe, right? Yeah. So 7 o'clock, the FCC announced they approved it, and like maybe 10 minutes later, Nexstar announced that they had actually closed the deal. There has been a lawsuit filed by 8 states, all states with Democratic governors. DirecTV has filed a lawsuit. I don't know that you can really do much it's possible, anything's possible, but once a deal closes, the courts are really reluctant to get in there and like pull something apart once it's been brought together. But I do think we will see a lot of maybe hypersensitivity to things that Nexstar does and attempts to go at it in different ways. And we were already seeing that before this deal closed. One of the things I was looking for in the FCC decision last night was what they said about WPIX, the CW station. So this is a station that Mission Broadcasting actually controls, but they have a shared service agreement with Nexstar. And back in a lot of cable operators, Comcast, Charter, Cox, DirecTV, all these guys challenged it and said that Nexstar was like getting around the media ownership rules with this whole deal with Mission. The FCC under the previous administration agreed, and they issued a fine in 2024 for over $1.2 million for Nexstar over this whole situation. Nexstar then immediately appealed it, and that's still pending all this time later. So I thought maybe the FCC decision would address it, but they didn't. They just said it remains open, and our action today does not prejudge or in any way prejudice the actions we may take in that proceeding. So we will continue to wait for a ruling on that. DirecTV also has an antitrust case that they had filed against Nexstar over these sidecar arrangements with companies like Mission and White Knight Broadcasting. In December of last year, the Second Circuit Court of Appeals said that, DirecTV has standing to pursue the case and kicked it back down to the Southern District of New York. So that is still pending. So there's still lots of litigation out there, even once the deal closes, but still, like, this is, for MVPDs, this is huge. I've been kind of calling it behind the scenes, the Nexstar Death Star in terms of like the retransmission consent implications here.
We need to copyright that. Copyright it immediately. If you ever say that in your own podcast or your own article, you owe us $1 at least. That's amazing.
March Merger Madness. You're on it with the nicknames.
Yeah, you're on fire.
But, it is kind of the Nexstar Death Star, because what's happening is in a lot of these markets now, they're going to have 2, sometimes even 3 stations. So if you have a blackout, you can't just turn to the other station in that market necessarily and watch the news. Or, usually you were only going to lose football games on CBS, but now you might lose football games on CBS and Fox. Like, it has some pretty big implications. I understand why there is some trepidation on the MVPD side. On the broadcast side, though, there's a whole other argument, and that's that they really need this to survive. I think there's some pretty big implications from this about how it sets the precedent for further broadcast consolidation, right?
I mean, yeah. Headline, big win for broadcast, right? I've been on tons of earnings calls for Nexstar, and CEO Perry Sook has long said that broadcasters need to get bigger to compete with big tech. Consolidation is definitely the most direct way to do that, and he's often argued that broadcast ownership rules should be changed because big tech isn't constrained by the same rules, and now we're seeing those FCC waivers coming through to enable these big mergers. One thing I also want to mention is that Sook has often said that the deal will empower further investment in local journalism. That's a piece of this that gets talked about a lot at these earnings calls as like one of the big benefits beyond, broadcast gets bigger. This, of course, sort of remains to be seen. Ironically, Nexstar just went through a round of layoffs at several of its local stations, and now it's going to own 2 or 3 stations in many of its markets. So you have to wonder how synergies are going to affect local journalists there. So when we talk about trepidations, I think if, I'm a local staffer at one of these stations, probably a little bit of trepidation there. And that's just, me speculating, but obviously there's going to be some changes. Something I found really interesting that Sook said at the most recent earnings call was that one of the big synergy opportunities in these markets will be real estate. So consolidating facilities in markets where they have more than one after the merger. So again, we'll see how this all pans out. What we do know, again, is that the merger closing will be great news for other broadcasters who want to get bigger. In fact, Sinclair, who recently tried to acquire Scripps, said in their recent earnings call that Nexstar-Tegna getting approved would set a precedent for approving other broadcast mergers. So basically, if the SEC is approving this massive deal, it shouldn't be a problem for the rest of us. And listen, Scripps may not have wanted to sell to Sinclair, but they also agree that waiving ownership rules is a good thing. They said in their most recent earnings call that they'd be interested in looking at any of the stations that Nexstar has to divest to get the Tegna close, which has happened now. So, again, just a big day for broadcast.
Yeah. And, I just, NAB, they don't really comment on specific transactions. And the same with NCTA. That's just how these associations work. They don't want to dive in on that. But I did notice that like late last night, shortly after everything went down, they came out and said, okay, we're not talking about any individual transaction, but, we're so happy the FCC recognized that the national ownership cap is outdated. So, I mean, it's all flags go, right? So the other merger we were going to talk about is Charter-Cox. It's a little less hectic, a little less controversial, maybe.
It was also a big week for Charter-Cox. The $34.5 billion deal was approved by the New York Public Utilities Commission. So that's another regulatory hurdle cleared for the deal. It had to, of course, agree to a few conditions. Among them, the combined company is required to invest at least $100 million to upgrade its network to symmetrical internet speeds of up to 1 gig per second across its New York footprint. It has to replace at least 500 outdoor Wi-Fi access points in the state to offer free non-customer access. It has to fund digital inclusion and community initiatives and invest $3 million to bring broadband service to unserved shelter locations. And I think there are a few other things as well. With New York on board, Charter-Cox now has the approvals from all local, state, and federal authorities except the state of California, which gave the companies 10 days to provide more info on the merger. So that's still in process. I should also note, obviously, that the deal already has the approval of the FCC. So good news there for both companies. But Amy, Noah, you have both been writing about this merger for a lot longer than I have. So I would love to hear your thoughts on this merger.
Well, I think I would just point on California. A lot's been made that we're still waiting on California, and we never know what could happen. But I would say that I don't see any huge red flags so far. I listened to some of those public hearings, and the thing with Charter and Cox is that they have done a lot in their community. So they have a lot of groups, a lot of people who are stepping up to say, we think this is good. So frankly, a lot of the public hearing was people saying, hey, this is a good idea. But there are concerns. PEG channels was one I heard a lot about. There's some concerns about, actually the idea was that a lot of people seem to think their bills will go down. And so the PUC wants some information on that. But I guess I just want to caution that just because we're waiting on California, it doesn't necessarily mean there's a problem in California. There could be. We don't know. The one thing that did strike me is like the ALJ, when she kicked off the hearing, she kind of indicated she seemed to be like in no big hurry to get things done. That would probably be the part that I'd be concerned about if you're waiting for this to close. And I don't know if that was just talk or whatever. Charter is certainly pushing them to act quickly, but it's a little bit different than another thing we saw happen at the California PUC, right, Noah?
Yes, I was going to say it felt it feels like this is a little bit more of a cleaner review process from California's perspective, at least, than the Verizon Frontier. That one felt a little more strenuous, and it felt like there was a little bit more of hoops to jump through. But they ultimately did reach the goal line there in California. But yeah, Charter-Cox doesn't feel the same sort of level of challenge or difficulty in navigating CPUC, or CPUC, however they call it. But yeah, and same thing with the public hearing for Verizon Frontier. When I listened, it felt, outside of a few calls that were complaining about other subjects, it felt, overwhelmingly positive for Verizon Frontier. So it, again, kind of matching what you heard with Charter-Cox.
Yeah, and I guess maybe in some ways too, that sets Verizon Frontier could have set a precedent, because I know, similar to with Verizon, Charter also went into the FCC and agreed to insert certain DEI programs. And, they dealt with that already with the Frontier, right? They had those conditions. They did what they did there. So I imagine that's probably a blueprint for how they would handle Charter-Cox. And I guess the other thing is just how the integrations will all go with these are two big companies. We're going to see, we've definitely heard a lot of noise about the onshoring of all these employees for call centers. Charter already does that, but Cox does not. There's some exciting things possibly to happen in Cox markets with video and mobile, just because Charter's further down the road. On the other hand, Cox has done a ton in business services, which I think Charter will really benefit from. We're just kind of waiting. We're waiting for California state of mind.
California dreaming.
So I teased, we had a little bit of a surprise merger. For me, this was a surprise. I didn't see this one coming. Did anyone?
No. And drum roll, it's G-Fiber and Astound. They're going to combine to create a new independent fiber provider. It's going to be majority owned by Stone Peak, an investment firm. G-Fiber, their parent company, or former parent company, I should say, Google, Alphabet, sold some of its share, but it'll still remain a significant minority investor. No financial terms were disclosed, so take a ballpark guess at how many zeros are on it. But G-Fiber kind of talked up the opportunities to combine some of its metropolitan networks with the cross-country infrastructure Astound has built, and Astound has a presence in a lot of metropolitan areas as well. And from a competition standpoint, New Street Research pointed this out. The combined G-Fiber Astound, they're going to have at least one cable competitor in 94% of its footprint. Charter and Comcast mainly being the biggest competitors, and that's sure to change once the Charter-Cox deal, if it goes through. AT&T is the largest ILEC competitor. Verizon is second, and speed-wise, 38% of G-Fiber and Astound's footprint has 0 or 1 gig capable competitors, and 62% will offer 2 gigs or more. But what's interesting especially with Astound is kind of that got announced before they had actually officially announced. Well, let's go back. They announced in November that they had hired a CEO, but they didn't name him. So it was kind of like, oh, okay, this was after this is also before Jim Holanda had officially left for Cable One, or he had officially stepped into that role. But Astound finally announced who it was, in the middle of March after first announcing this in November. It is Etienne Brandt. He was formerly the EVP of Business at Frontier. He was there for about 3.5 years. Spent a majority of his career, or all of it, across the pond. He worked for companies like British Telecom, EE, Orange, NTL, I think, as well, working throughout the United Kingdom and South Africa as well. And he'll have quite an interesting, task, because he's not only tasked with growing the company, but he also has to navigate it through a merger with G-Fiber. And something else too that we've kind of noticed in the G-Fiber press release was that they specified that the existing G-Fiber executive team or leadership team is going to stay in place after the merger. So it's unknown what will happen with Astound, Brandt included, but it's probably something that we'll figure out as time goes on. And that deal is expected to close by the end of 2026. So a relatively quick merger process that they're expecting. But Amy, I agree with you. It kind of was one of those out of left field ones, but it makes sense when you think about it. It's not, out of left field in the realm or in the sense of why, or you just never saw that. But it is one of those random ones. Like, okay.
Yeah, well, I think that's kind of, we are in March merger madness, and I think there is this lots of folks are out there looking for their partner, right? There's a lot of I heard a lot of buzz came from MetroNet conference. I think that some of that was happening there behind the scenes, and I suspect we won't make it through this year without some more deals to talk about. But I was just thinking back to Charter-Cox. One thing I did want to point out is that the New York PUC, while they did approve the deal, they haven't actually publicly released that order yet. So some of those conditions that John were talking about, I want to dig in a little more and see some of the details, but we don't have them yet, just so you know. That's why we can't tell you exactly what those are. So we'll be watching and reporting about it in Cable Facts. And we'll, of course, continue to keep a close eye on all of these mergers. I think there's like another one out there. It involves some little company called like Warner Brothers Discovery. I don't know if you guys have heard of them. But
Who?
yeah. And the other one's like Paramount. Am I saying that right? But as always, thank you for tuning in to CFX Download. Remember, you can check out new episodes on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts, as well as find our in-depth coverage at cablefacts.com. See you next time.